Byron Uyasugi. In Honolulu, Hawaii, a morning meeting at Xerox Corporation began like any other on November 2, 1999. 7 employees gathered in a second-floor conference room at 8 o'clock in the morning, preparing to discuss the workday ahead. Brian Koji Uyasugi, a 40-year-old service technician who had worked at the company for 15 years, arrived with a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol. What happened next would become Hawaii's deadliest incident of its kind. Uyasugi entered the conference room where his supervisor and 6 co-workers sat. He began firing, methodically targeting each person in the room. The Glock was loaded with hollow-point ammunition designed to cause maximum impact. He fired 28 rounds in total, moving through the room with deliberate precision. Some victims were struck at close range. One co-worker who had been in the room managed to flee before being hit, though Uyasugi fired at him as he escaped. The 7 people in that conference room had no warning, no chance to defend themselves. Melvin Lee, 58 years old and Uyasugi's supervisor, was among those struck. Ford Kanehira, 41. Ronald Kataoka, 50. Ronald Kawamai, 54. Peter Mark, 46. John Sakamoto, 36. Christopher Balatico, 33. All were Xerox employees. All were ended in the conference room that morning. After the shooting stopped, Uyasugi left the building. He got into his van and drove away from the scene. Police were alerted immediately and began searching for him. They located him at the Hawaii Nature Center, where a 5-hour standoff ensued. Negotiators worked to convince him to surrender. Eventually, he complied peacefully, exiting his vehicle and allowing officers to take him into custody without further incident. What had driven someone to commit such an act? The investigation into Uyasugi's motives revealed a complex picture of workplace grievances and mental health issues. Uyasugi believed his co-workers were conspiring against him. He thought they were sabotaging his work, deliberately making his job more difficult. The company had been introducing new training for color copiers, technology that required learning new systems. Uyasugi had resisted this training, and he believed his resistance had made him a target. During psychiatric evaluations, Uyasugi described paranoid delusions. He was convinced that colleagues were spreading rumors about him. He thought they were tampering with equipment he was supposed to service, setting him up for failure. These beliefs had festered over time, creating a worldview in which he was under constant attack from the people around him. The evaluations revealed symptoms consistent with schizophrenia, though formal diagnosis was complicated. His behavior at work had shown warning signs. He had previously displayed anger, including an incident where he kicked an elevator door. He had made statements that suggested hostility toward coworkers. But these incidents had not triggered the kind of intervention that might have prevented what happened. The legal proceedings began with Uyasugi facing serious charges. He was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder, which, under Hawaii law, applies to a single act causing multiple deaths, and 1 count of attempted second-degree murder for the employee who escaped. His trial started in May 2000, with his defense team arguing that he was not criminally responsible due to his mental state. They presented evidence of his delusions and psychiatric history. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined Uyasugi. All 3 confirmed that he suffered from significant mental health issues. They testified that he lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the incident. The defense built their case around the argument that Uyasugi's delusions had prevented him from understanding what he was doing. But the prosecution presented a different narrative. They argued that despite his mental health issues, Uyasugi knew what he was doing. He had brought the weapon to work. He had entered a specific room where specific people were gathered. He had fired methodically. These actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated awareness and intent. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes on June 13, 2000. They rejected the insanity defense and found Uyesugi guilty on all counts. The verdict meant that despite his mental health issues, the jury believed he bore criminal responsibility for what had happened in that conference room. On August 8, 2000, Uyesugi was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of what he had done. 7 lives taken in a single morning, families destroyed, a community traumatized. His legal team filed appeals, arguing that the jury instructions had been flawed and that his mental state should have resulted in a different verdict. The Hawaii Supreme Court reviewed the case and upheld the conviction in 2002. The appeals court found no reversible error in how the trial had been conducted. Uyesugi's conviction stood, and his sentence remained in place. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. During psychiatric interviews, Uyesugi made statements about his reasoning. He told Dr. Michael Wellner that they were intimidating me, and that he had decided to give them a reason to fire me. These statements revealed his perception of events, that he was acting in response to persecution, even though that persecution existed primarily in his mind. Co-workers who had known Uyesugi described him as quiet but angry. They had noticed his hostility, but had not anticipated this level of action. The disconnect between their observations and what he actually did became part of the broader discussion about workplace safety and recognizing warning signs. Uyesugi is currently serving his sentence at Saguaro Correctional Center in Arizona, where Hawaii houses some of its inmates due to capacity issues. The case remains the worst incident of its kind in Hawaii's history. It prompted discussions about workplace protocols, mental health resources, and early intervention systems that might prevent similar tragedies. The families of the 7 victims have lived with the aftermath for more than 2 decades. They lost loved ones who went to work expecting an ordinary day and never returned. The trauma extends beyond the immediate families to the broader community, which was forced to confront the reality that such events could happen anywhere. From Hawaii, the pattern would repeat decades later in Virginia. Andre Bing. At a Walmart supercenter in Chesapeake, Virginia, employees gathered in the break room just before 10:15 on the evening of November 22, 2022. It was a pre-shift meeting, routine for the overnight team preparing to stock shelves and serve customers through the night. Andre Marcus Bing, a 31-year-old overnight team leader, entered the break room carrying a 9mm handgun. He began firing without warning. The weapon had been purchased legally that same morning. Bing underwent a standard background check, but Virginia law does not mandate a waiting period for firearm purchases, obtaining the firearm just hours before using it. He arrived at the store for his shift, armed and determined. When the meeting began, he opened fire on the people gathered there. 6 co-workers lost their lives in the break room. 4 others sustained injuries. Bing targeted specific individuals, people whose names appeared on a list he had been maintaining. The shooting was not random. It was a deliberate act against people he believed had wronged him. He reloaded as needed, continuing until his targets were struck. Then he turned the weapon on himself. Police responded to emergency calls from the store. When they arrived, they found Bing deceased from a self-inflicted wound, surrounded by the victims of his actions. The scene was processed carefully, with investigators documenting everything and collecting evidence. The break room, where employees should have been safe, had become a crime scene. The investigation into Bing's motives began immediately. Authorities discovered a note on his phone, what he called a death note. in which he attempted to explain his actions. The note contained apologies mixed with blame. He referenced feeling mocked and harassed by coworkers. He called them idiots with low IQ and claimed to be led by Satan in his actions. What had created such hatred toward his coworkers? Bing felt that they were laughing at him behind his back, making him the subject of jokes and derision. He also claimed his phone had been hacked, suggesting paranoid thinking that went beyond normal workplace conflicts. The combination of perceived harassment and paranoid beliefs created a mindset in which extreme action seemed justified to him. Coworkers who had worked with Bing described him as gruff and paranoid. He was not someone who engaged in friendly conversation or built relationships with those around him. He kept to himself, maintaining distance from the team he was supposed to lead. But while he was difficult to work with, no one had anticipated he would resort to this level of action. Months before the incident, Bing had asked about active shooter training. The question should have been a red flag, an indication that he was thinking about such scenarios. But the inquiry did not trigger the kind of response that might have prevented what happened. It was noted, but not acted upon, in a way that changed the outcome. Investigators searched Bing's home and found ammunition and handwritten notes. The notes provided additional insight into his thinking in the period leading up to the incident. He had been planning, accumulating supplies, and fixating on perceived wrongs. The forensic evidence painted a picture of someone who had been building toward this moment over time. Because Bing took his own life at the scene, there would be no trial. The investigation had to rely on physical evidence, witness statements, and the materials he left behind. The death note on his phone became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding what had motivated him, even though many questions remained unanswered. Families of the victims filed a lawsuit against Walmart, alleging negligence. The suit claimed that the company had ignored warnings about Bing's behavior. Employees had complained about him, expressing concern about his conduct and demeanor. The lawsuit argued that Walmart had failed to take appropriate action to protect its workers from a threat that should have been recognized. Walmart eventually reached settlements with the families, agreeing to pay millions in compensation. The settlements did not include admissions of liability, but provided financial support to families dealing with the loss of loved ones and the trauma of what had occurred. For the families, no amount of money could replace what they had lost, but the settlements acknowledged that something had gone wrong in how Bing's behavior had been handled. Interviews with surviving co-workers revealed the terror of that night. They described the sudden transformation of a familiar space into a scene of horror. People they worked with every night were struck down in front of them. Some survived by hiding or escaping. Others were not as fortunate. The psychological trauma extended beyond physical injuries to include lasting emotional scars. The 6 people who lost their lives were Lorenzo, Gamble, Brian Pendleton, Kelly Pyle, Randall Blevins, Tynika Johnson, and 16-year-old Fernando Chavez Barron, whose name was later released by the family and authorities. Each had come to work that night expecting an ordinary shift. Each had families waiting for them to come home. None returned. As of 2026, the Chesapeake community continues to process what happened. The Walmart store has remained open, though for many in the community, it serves as a reminder of the tragedy. Discussions about workplace safety, threat assessment, and employer responsibility continue, prompted by this case and others like it. The pattern of workplace grievances turning into tragedies was not new. Michael McDermott. In Wakefield, Massachusetts, a software testing company called Edgewater Technology employed dozens of people in the year 2000. Michael Morgan McDermott worked there as a software tester. a position that required attention to detail, but little interaction with others. On December 26, 2000, the day after Christmas, McDermott brought weapons to work and took 7 lives in the company's human resources and accounting departments. McDermott was born Michael McDermott Martinez on September 4, 1958, in Plymouth, Massachusetts. He grew up in nearby Marshfield in a working-class family. Little is known about his early childhood, but he faced struggles with his mental health from a young age. He experienced depression and visual distortions that led to claustrophobia and what doctors later described as fugue states. McDermott served in the United States Navy, but was discharged after hospitalizations for severe depression. Military service was cut short by his inability to function effectively due to his mental health issues. After leaving the Navy, he worked various jobs before finding employment at Edgewater Technology. There, his technical skills were valued, and he was able to function in a role that played to his strengths. But financial problems began to overwhelm him. McDermott owed $5,600 in back taxes, and the Internal Revenue Service had initiated wage garnishment to collect what he owed. Each paycheck was smaller than expected, with a portion automatically deducted to pay his tax debt. For someone already struggling financially, this garnishment created severe stress. How did financial stress lead to such extreme action? The day before the incident, McDermott smuggled weapons into the office. He brought them in piece by piece, hiding them where they would not be noticed. He prepared methodically, planning what he would do the next day. On December 26th, weapons in place, he went to the human resources and accounting departments, the areas of the company responsible for payroll and the wage garnishment he blamed for his financial troubles. McDermott fired 37 rounds that morning. He moved through the departments, targeting people at their desks. 7 employees were struck and did not survive. The victims were people doing their jobs, processing paperwork, managing accounts, unaware that they had been marked as targets by someone who blamed them for his problems. After the shooting stopped, McDermott did not flee or resist. He surrendered calmly when police arrived, offering no resistance to arrest. His demeanor was notable. He appeared detached from what had just occurred, as if he had completed a task rather than taken 7 lives. This calmness would later become relevant in discussions about his mental state. During police interviews, McDermott made statements that revealed the delusions underlying his actions. Claimed he had to terminate 7 men without injuring innocents, and that his victims were actually historical figures. He believed he had time traveled and that the people he ended were Hitler and his generals. These statements suggested a profound disconnect from reality, a worldview in which he was carrying out some kind of historical mission, rather than ending the lives of coworkers. Forensic examination of McDermott's computer revealed troubling information. He had been researching how to fake insanity, looking up information about mental health defenses in criminal cases. This research suggested calculation and premeditation, that he was planning not just the act itself, but also how to respond afterward in a way that might lead to a different legal outcome. The trial began in 2002. McDermott's defense team argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. They presented evidence of his long history of mental health issues, including diagnoses consistent with schizophrenia. They pointed to his delusional statements about time travel and Nazis as evidence that he had been psychotic during the incident. Multiple psychiatric experts testified that McDermott suffered from serious mental illness. They confirmed that his delusions were genuine, not fabricated. But the prosecution argued that despite his mental illness, McDermott knew what he was doing. The computer searches about faking insanity suggested he understood the legal implications of his actions. The methodical preparation suggested planning and awareness. The jury rejected the insanity defense and found McDermott guilty. They concluded that while he was mentally ill, he still bore criminal responsibility for what he had done. The verdict meant he would face punishment rather than psychiatric commitment. He was sentenced to 7 life terms without the possibility of parole, one for each person whose life he had taken. Families of the victims attended the trial and spoke about their losses. They described loved ones who had gone to work the day after Christmas and never returned. The 7 victims, Craig Wood, Cheryl Troy, Jennifer Bragg Capobianco, Louis Javel, Janice Haggerty, Rose Manfredi, and Paul Marceau, were remembered not as generic casualties, but as individuals with families, friends, and futures that were stolen from them. McDermott appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial had been flawed and that his mental state should have resulted in a different verdict. The appeals were unsuccessful. The courts found that despite his mental illness, the evidence supported the jury's conclusion that he was criminally responsible. As of 2026, McDermott, now 68 years old, remains in Massachusetts maximum security prison, serving 7 life sentences with no possibility of release. The Postal Service would see similar tragedy years earlier. Patrick Sherrill. In Edmond, Oklahoma, a postal worker arrived for his shift on August 20th, 1986. Patrick Henry Sherrill had been employed by the United States Postal Service for 16 months, working as a letter carrier. That morning, he brought firearms to work and used them against his supervisors and co-workers. By the time the incident ended, 14 people had lost their lives, and Sherrill himself was deceased from a self-inflicted wound. Sherrill was born on November 13, 1941, in Watonga, Oklahoma. His childhood and adolescence were marked by social isolation. He was known locally as Crazy Pat due to his anger issues and obsession with firearms. He had difficulty forming relationships and was seen as odd by those who knew him. His social awkwardness and reputation followed him throughout his life. Sherrill served in the United States Marine Corps, but never saw overseas deployment. He later joined the Oklahoma Air National Guard, where he became known as an excellent marksman. His skill with firearms was notable, and he took pride in his abilities. But his military service did not provide the sense of purpose or belonging he seemed to seek. After his military service, Sherrill held various jobs with limited success. His interpersonal difficulties made it hard for him to maintain employment or build stable relationships. When he joined the Postal Service in 1985, it seemed like a position that might suit him. The job had structure, clear expectations, and did not require extensive social interaction beyond delivering mail. But Sherrill's performance at the Postal Service was problematic. He had issues with his route, struggling to complete deliveries in the expected time frame. Supervisors criticized his work, and he believed he was being unfairly targeted. The day before the incident, he had received a reprimand from his supervisors about his performance. This disciplinary action appears to have been the trigger that pushed him toward extreme action. On the morning of August 20th, Sherrill arrived at the post office armed with 2 Colt .45 semi-automatic pistols. He entered the building at 6:30 in the morning, when many employees were beginning their shifts. He first targeted the supervisors who had reprimanded him, then began firing at other co-workers who happened to be present. The incident lasted approximately 15 minutes. Sherrill moved through the building, firing at people at their workstations. Some victims were struck at their sorting stations. Others were hit as they tried to flee or hide. The postal facility, which should have been a safe workplace, became a scene of chaos and terror. 14 postal workers lost their lives that morning. 6 others sustained injuries but survived. The victims ranged in age and experience. Some were veteran postal workers who had spent decades with the service, while others were relatively new employees. All had simply come to work, expecting an ordinary day. How had no one anticipated this would happen? Police responded quickly to emergency calls from the facility. When they arrived, the shooting had stopped. They found Cheryl deceased from a self-inflicted wound to the head. He had taken his own life after ending the lives of his co-workers. The scene confronting first responders was devastating. Bodies throughout the facility, survivors in shock, and the realization that one person had caused all of this in a matter of minutes. Because Cheryl ended his own life, there would be no trial. No opportunity to hear him explain his actions or to see him held accountable in a courtroom. The investigation had to piece together what had happened and why based on physical evidence, witness statements, and his history. The reprimand from supervisors the day before appeared to be the immediate trigger. But his long-standing social difficulties and anger issues provided context for why he responded so extremely. Co-workers who survived described Cheryl as someone who kept to himself and seemed angry much of the time. They had noticed his hostility, but had not imagined he would resort to this level of action. The disconnect between observing someone who was difficult and recognizing someone who was dangerous became part of the broader conversation about workplace safety. The Edmond Post Office incident became a landmark case in discussions about workplace safety. The phrase "going postal" entered American vernacular, a darkly ironic reference to this and subsequent incidents involving postal workers. For the Postal Service, the Edmond incident prompted reviews of workplace policies and threat assessment procedures. Questions arose about whether warning signs had been missed and whether more could have been done to prevent such tragedies. Another postal worker would follow a similar path years later. Thomas McIlvaine. In Royal Oak, Michigan, a postal facility became the scene of tragedy on November 14, 1991. Thomas McIlvaine, a former postal worker who had been terminated from his position, returned to the facility armed with a Ruger semi-automatic rifle. He targeted supervisors and co-workers, taking 4 lives and injuring 5 others before ending his own life. McIlvaine was born on March 31, 1957. He grew up in the Detroit area and eventually found employment with the United States Postal Service. His career with the Postal Service was marked by disciplinary problems and conflicts with supervisors. He had been fired in 1989 for insubordination and poor performance. But he fought the termination and was reinstated after filing grievances. The reinstatement did not resolve the underlying issues. McIlvaine continued to have problems at work, accumulating more disciplinary actions. In 1990, he was fired, again, this time for threatening a supervisor. He appealed this termination as well, taking his case through the grievance process and eventually to arbitration. The arbitrator upheld his firing, ending his employment with the Postal Service permanently. McIlvaine did not accept the arbitration decision quietly. He made statements to co-workers and others suggesting he would seek revenge. He talked about taking action against those he blamed for his termination. These statements were reported to management, but the response was not sufficient to prevent what happened. The threat was known, but not adequately addressed. On November 14, 1991, McIlvaine drove to the Royal Oak Postal Facility. He arrived in the early afternoon carrying a Ruger rifle. He entered the building and began searching for specific targets, the supervisors who had been involved in his discipline and termination. When he found them, he opened fire. His first target was Christopher Carlisle, postal supervisor who had been directly involved in McIlvaine's disciplinary proceedings. McIlvaine shot him at close range. He then moved through the facility, targeting others on his list. The shooting was not random. It was a deliberate act of revenge against people he blamed for the loss of his job. 4 people lost their lives in the facility that day. The victims were Christopher Carlisle, supervisor, Mary Benincasa, clerk, Keith Clow, clerk, and Rosemarie Fiumara, clerk. The other names provided are associated with different incidents. 5 others were injured, some seriously. The casualties were all postal employees who had been at work, fulfilling their duties, when McIlvaine arrived with a rifle. After the shooting, McIlvaine took his own life. Police found him deceased from a self-inflicted wound. Like Cheryl before him, McIlvaine did not survive to face trial or provide direct testimony about his motives. The investigation relied on his history, his statements to others before the incident, and the pattern of his actions to understand why he had done what he did. The investigation revealed that McIlvaine had made explicit threats. He had told people he would make them pay and that he would get even. These threats were known to postal management. Reports had been filed. But the system failed to prevent him from returning to the facility and carrying out his threats. The knowledge that he was dangerous did not translate into effective action to protect potential targets. The Royal Oak incident came just 5 years after the Edmonds shooting. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Terminated or disciplined postal workers returning to facilities to exact revenge. The Postal Service faced increasing pressure to address workplace safety and threat assessment. The phrase "going postal" gained wider currency, reflecting public awareness that postal workplaces seemed particularly vulnerable to this type of incident. Families of the victims filed lawsuits against the Postal Service, alleging negligence in failing to protect employees from a known threat. The suits argued that McIlvaine's threats had been reported and that management had failed to take adequate precautions. The legal proceedings highlighted systemic failures in how the organization responded to problematic employees and threats of revenge. The 4 people who died had been fulfilling their duties as postal workers. They were processing mail, supervising operations, serving the public. They lost their lives not because of anything they had done wrong, but because the system meant to protect them had failed. Pennsylvania would see workplace tragedy unfold in a different industry. David DeLong. At Great Lakes Cast Equipment Corporation in Easton, Pennsylvania, a former employee returned on January 17, 2005. David DeLong, 57 years old, had been terminated from his position at the foundry after an argument with supervisors. He came back with a 12-gauge shotgun and ended 3 lives before taking his own. DeLong had worked at Great Lakes Cast Equipment for 15 years. The company manufactured steel castings, heavy industrial work that required physical labor and technical skill. DeLong had been a long-time employee, familiar with the facility and the people who worked there. But his employment ended in conflict, with an argument that led to his termination. The details of what led to his firing are limited in public records. What is known is that there was a dispute with supervisors, tension that escalated to the point where the company decided to end his employment. For DeLong, the termination appears to have been unacceptable. Rather than accepting the decision and moving on, he chose to return with a weapon. On the morning of January 17th, DeLong entered the foundry carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. He confronted supervisors and co-workers opening fire in the facility. The shotgun blasts were devastating in the enclosed industrial space. 3 men were struck and did not survive their injuries. The victims were James Pellecchio, plant manager, Michael Ruff, production manager, and Donald Neiman, operations manager. All 3 held supervisory positions at the foundry. They were targeted specifically because of their roles in the company's management, likely because DeLong blamed them for his termination. The shooting was an act of revenge against people he held responsible for the end of his career at the company. After ending the lives of the 3 supervisors, DeLong turned the shotgun on himself. Police arriving at the scene found 4 bodies, the 3 victims and DeLong himself, deceased from a self-inflicted wound. The incident was over quickly, but the impact on the company and community would last far longer. Because DeLong took his own life, there was no trial and no opportunity to hear him explain his actions in court. The investigation had to rely on his employment history, the circumstances of his termination, and the pattern of his actions to understand his motives. The deliberate targeting of management suggested this was revenge for being fired, a final act against people he believed had wronged him. Co-workers who survived described shock and disbelief. The foundry was not a place where people expected such things to happen. It was a manufacturing facility where people worked with heavy equipment and molten metal, dangerous in its own ways, but not a place where they anticipated this kind of deliberate action from a former employee. The 3 victims left behind families who had to grapple with sudden, unexpected loss. They had gone to work that morning with no indication that danger awaited. Their roles as managers meant they made decisions that sometimes led to employee terminations, a normal part of business operations. Illinois would see a similar pattern unfold at another manufacturing plant. William Baker. At the Navistar engine plant in Melrose Park, Illinois, a former employee arrived on February 5, 2001. William Baker, 66 years old, had been terminated from his position at the diesel engine manufacturing facility. He returned with multiple firearms and took 4 lives before ending his own. Baker had worked at the plant for 39 years, beginning his career there in 1962. Nearly 4 decades of service gave him deep familiarity with the facility, the people, and the operations. But his long tenure did not protect him from termination when the company determined his employment should end. He was fired in 1994 for stealing a trailer, a decision that appears to have festered for years before he took action. Why did Baker wait 7 years before seeking revenge? The delay between his termination in 1994 and the incident in 2001 is unusual. Most workplace revenge incidents happen relatively soon after the triggering event, a firing, a disciplinary action, a perceived injustice. But Baker waited years, suggesting either that his anger built slowly over time or that something in early 2001 prompted him to finally act on long-held grievances. On February 5th, Baker arrived at the plant armed with a rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol. He entered the facility and began targeting people, moving through areas he knew well from his decades of employment. The firearms gave him the capacity to cause extensive harm, and he used them against former co-workers and supervisors. 4 people lost their lives in the attack. Robert Verheim, Daniel Dorsch, Thomas Kreppel, and Martin Reutemann were all Navistar employees who happened to be at work when Baker arrived. One was a supervisor, the others were co-workers. The targeting appears to have been somewhat random, with Baker shooting people he encountered rather than hunting for specific individuals. After the shooting, Baker took his own life. Police found him deceased from a self-inflicted wound, surrounded by the firearms he had brought to the plant. The scene was processed carefully, with investigators working to understand what had happened and why someone would wait 7 years to seek revenge for a termination. The investigation revealed that Baker had been planning the attack. He had accumulated the firearms legally over time. He had made statements to people suggesting he felt wronged by his termination and believed the company had treated him unfairly. But nothing in his planning had been obvious enough to alert authorities or the company before he acted. The 7-year gap between termination and revenge raised questions about what had triggered him to act when he did. Had there been a recent event that reminded him of his firing? Had financial stress accumulated to the point where he blamed the company for his current circumstances? The answers died with Baker, leaving investigators to speculate about what finally pushed him to act after so many years. For Navistar, the incident demonstrated that workplace threats could emerge even years after an employee left the company. Traditional security measures focused on immediate threats. Recently terminated employees, people who had made recent threats, current employees showing warning signs. But Baker had been gone for 7 years, long enough that he might not have been on anyone's radar as a potential threat. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The pattern would emerge again, this time involving a postal worker in California. Jennifer San Marco. In Goleta, California, a former postal worker returned to a mail processing facility on January 30th, 2006. Jennifer San Marco, 44 years old, had worked for the United States Postal Service until 2003, when she was placed on medical leave due to psychological issues. 3 years after leaving, she came back armed with a 9mm pistol. Before the night ended, 7 people had lost their lives, 6 at the facility and 1 neighbor, and San Marco herself was deceased. San Marco's employment with the Postal Service had ended badly. She had exhibited increasingly erratic behavior at work, making co-workers uncomfortable with strange statements and actions. Supervisors documented concerns about her mental state. Eventually, the decision was made to place her on medical leave, effectively ending her career with the organization. She never returned to work after that leave began. In the 3 years between her departure and her return, San Marco's mental state appears to have deteriorated further. She moved to New Mexico, where neighbors described her as paranoid and hostile. She claimed people were monitoring her, that she was being followed, that conspiracies surrounded her. These delusions consumed her thinking and isolated her from normal social interaction. On the evening of January 30th, before going to the postal facility, San Marco went to the home of a former neighbor in Santa Barbara. Beverly Graham, a woman in her 50s, answered the door. San Marco shot her multiple times, taking her life in the doorway of her own home. This initial action appeared to be connected to San Marco's paranoid beliefs about who had wronged her. From Santa Barbara, San Marco drove to the mail processing facility in Goleta where she had once worked. She arrived around 7 in the evening, entering the building where the night shift was processing mail. She moved through the facility with a 9mm pistol, targeting people she encountered. 6 postal workers lost their lives in the facility that night. The victims at the facility were Charlotte Colton, 54, Nicola Grant, 42, Malika Higgins, 28, James Shannon, 57, Zeze Magsaysay, 44, and Richard Lanerge, 37. Guadalupe Swartz was not a victim in this incident. Each was struck as they went about their duties, sorting and processing mail for delivery the next day. After moving through the facility and taking the lives of 5 co-workers, San Marco went into a restroom and ended her own life. Police responding to emergency calls found her body there, along with the weapon she had used. The scene was one of chaos. Postal workers had fled or hidden. Emergency responders were treating injured survivors, and investigators were beginning to process what had happened. The investigation quickly established San Marco's identity and her history with the Postal Service. Her employment records documented the psychological issues that had led to her medical leave. Co-workers interviewed after the incident described her as someone who had been difficult to work with. whose behavior had raised concerns long before she was placed on leave. Why had she returned after 3 years? The answer appeared to lie in her deteriorating mental state. Writings found in her possession revealed paranoid delusions about the Postal Service and former co-workers. She believed she had been persecuted, that people had conspired against her, that she needed to take action against those who had wronged her. The specific grievances were unclear, filtered through her distorted perception of reality. Neighbors in New Mexico, where she had been living, described strange behavior. She had posted rambling screeds on her apartment door, making accusations against various people and organizations. She talked about being monitored and followed. She appeared to be living in a world shaped by delusions, unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined persecution. The Goleta incident came 20 years after the Edmond post office shooting, 16 years after Royal Oak. The phrase "going postal" had become part of American vocabulary, and now another postal workplace had been the scene of tragedy. For the Postal Service, the incident raised renewed questions about how the organization handled employees with mental health issues, and whether more could be done to prevent former employees from returning to facilities. The 6 victims, Beverly Graham and the 5 postal workers, left behind families struggling to understand. Graham had simply answered her door. The postal workers had been at their jobs, fulfilling essential duties. None had done anything to deserve what happened. They became victims of someone's untreated mental illness and paranoid delusions. For the Goleta community and the broader postal workforce, the incident served as another reminder of vulnerability. Security measures could only do so much when a determined individual with a weapon decided to act. The randomness of who lived and who died that night, determined by who happened to be in San Marcos' path, underscored the arbitrary nature of such tragedies. Because San Marco took her own life, there was no trial, no opportunity for a legal process to provide some sense of accountability. The investigation concluded that she was responsible, that her actions stemmed from mental illness and paranoid thinking. But that conclusion came from examining evidence rather than hearing testimony. The Postal Service reviewed its protocols for handling employees with mental health issues. Questions arose about whether San Marco should have been flagged in some system that would have prevented her from accessing postal facilities. While San Marco's actions stemmed from mental illness, the next case would involve perceived discrimination. Omar Thornton. At a beer distributorship in Manchester, Connecticut, a driver arrived for a meeting on August 3, 2010. Omar Thornton, 34 years old, had been caught stealing beer from the warehouse where he worked. Security footage showed him loading product into his vehicle without authorization. Management called him in to discuss the theft, giving him the option to resign rather than be terminated. Hartford Distributors was a beer and wine wholesaler that employed about 50 people. Thornton had worked there as a driver for 2 years, delivering products to customers across the region. The theft had been discovered through video surveillance that showed him taking cases of beer over multiple occasions. When confronted with the evidence, he agreed to resign. But before leaving the building, Thornton retrieved 2 9mm pistols from his lunch bag. He had brought them to work that morning, suggesting he had anticipated what might happen and planned his response. When the resignation meeting concluded, Thornton did not simply walk out. He began shooting. 8 people lost their lives in the warehouse that morning. Brian Sirigliano, 51, a driver. Craig Pepin, 60, a driver. Victor James, 60, a warehouse worker. Edwin Kennison, 54, a warehouse worker. Louis Felder, 50, a driver. Douglas Scruton, 56, a driver. Francis Fazio Jr., 57, a driver. William Ackerman, 51, a driver. Most were drivers like Thornton, union brothers who had worked alongside him. 2 others sustained injuries, but survived. Thornton moved through the warehouse, targeting people he encountered. The shooting unfolded quickly, with workers scrambling to hide or escape. Some made it out of the building. Others were not fast enough or were in the wrong place when Thornton came through. As police surrounded the building, Thornton called his mother from inside the warehouse. He told her he had taken action because of racial discrimination at work. He claimed he had been subjected to harassment, that racist graffiti had been found in the bathroom, that he had been treated unfairly because he was black. He said he had been driven to this by the treatment he received. The call to his mother was the only time Thornton articulated his claimed motive. He did not leave written statements or manifestos. His girlfriend later said he had mentioned experiencing discrimination at work, though she had not witnessed it directly. She said he had shown her cell phone photos of what he claimed was racist graffiti in the workplace bathroom. Company officials and co-workers disputed the discrimination claims. Teamsters union representatives said they had received no complaints from Thornton about discrimination. The union had procedures for addressing such grievances, and there was no record of Thornton filing any complaint about racial harassment. Co-workers interviewed said they had not witnessed discrimination against Thornton or heard him complain about such treatment. The investigation examined whether discrimination had occurred. No evidence was found to substantiate Thornton's claims. The company had video evidence of his theft, which was the documented reason for calling him in that morning. Whether he genuinely believed he was discriminated against or whether he fabricated the claim to justify his actions remained unclear. What was clear was that he had brought weapons to work and used them against people who had been his co-workers. After the call to his mother, Thornton took his own life as police prepared to enter the building. Officers found his body in an office area, along with the 2 pistols he had used. The 8 victims had been working men, most of them drivers who spent their days delivering beer and wine to stores and restaurants. They had families, routines, lives outside work. That morning, they had reported for their shifts with no indication that one of their co-workers would turn against them. Some had been in the meeting where Thornton was confronted about theft. Others had simply been in the building when he began shooting. For the families of victims, Thornton's claim of discrimination became a source of additional pain. They rejected the notion that racism justified what he had done. Even if his claims had been true, which investigators found no evidence to support, taking the lives of co-workers was not a rational or acceptable response. The families emphasized that the men who died had not been responsible for any discrimination Thornton might have experienced. The incident prompted discussions about workplace discrimination and how companies handle such complaints. If Thornton had genuinely experienced harassment, the proper channels existed for addressing it through the union and company grievance procedures. The fact that he had not used those channels suggested either that the discrimination did not occur or that he chose not to pursue formal complaints. The union representing Hartford Distributors workers emphasized that their contract had strong anti-discrimination provisions. They had a history of addressing such complaints when they arose. The absence of any complaints from Thornton suggested he had not attempted to resolve any issues through the established system. Because Thornton took his own life, there was no trial where evidence could be presented and examined. His claims about discrimination remained unproven allegations made in a phone call during his final moments. Minnesota would see a similar tragedy unfold at a sign company Andrew Engeldinger. At Accent Signage Systems in Minneapolis, Minnesota, an employee received notice of termination on September 27, 2012. Andrew Engeldinger, 36 years old, had worked at the company as a sign production worker. His performance had been problematic, with supervisors documenting issues that led to the decision to end his employment. When he was called into a meeting that afternoon to receive the news, he responded with immediate action. Accent Signage Systems was a small business that created custom signs for commercial clients. The company employed about 25 people in a facility where they designed, manufactured, and installed signage. Engeldinger had worked there for several years, but his performance had deteriorated to the point where management decided termination was necessary. When Engeldinger was told he was being fired, he left the meeting room and went to his locker. He retrieved a Glock 9mm pistol that he had brought to work that day. Whether he anticipated being fired and brought the weapon in preparation, or whether he had it for other reasons, remains unclear. What is clear is that once he had the weapon, he returned to the area where the meeting had taken place. Engeldinger began shooting, first targeting the owner of the company and the human resources manager who had delivered the termination news. Reuven Rahamim, the owner and founder of Accent Signage Systems, was struck and did not survive. Keith Basinski, who handled human resources and operations, was also struck and did not survive. Engeldinger then moved through the facility. 4 more people died at the scene, and a 5th victim died later at the hospital. The victims were Reuven Rahamim, Keith Basinski, Jacob Beneke, Ronald Edberg, Rami Cooks, and UPS driver Eric Rivers. Devin Powell was seriously injured but survived the attack. The UPS driver, Eric Rivers, was not an employee of Accent Signage. He had simply been at the building making a routine delivery when Engeldinger began shooting. His presence at that moment made him a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He lost his life while performing his job, delivering packages to a business he had no connection to beyond that day's route. 4 others sustained injuries during the incident. Workers fled through exits or hid in offices and storage areas. Some made it out of the building. Others sheltered in place, hoping Engeldinger would not find them. The facility, which should have been a normal workplace, transformed into a scene of terror in minutes. Police responded to emergency calls and surrounded the building. As officers prepared to enter, they heard a final gunshot. Engeldinger had taken his own life in a stairwell. When police found him, the weapon was nearby, and the shooting was over. The scene they encountered inside was devastating. 7 bodies, injured survivors, and employees in shock from what had just occurred. The investigation into Engeldinger's background revealed a troubled individual. He had mental health issues that had been documented over years. He had difficulty maintaining relationships and holding jobs. His performance at Accent Signage had declined, with supervisors noting problems with quality and attitude. The termination was the culmination of ongoing issues, not a sudden decision. But nothing in his documented history suggested he would respond to termination with such extreme action. He had not made threats against coworkers or management. He had not exhibited behavior that would have triggered security concerns. The fact that he brought a weapon to work on the day he was fired suggested either planning or a general readiness to use force. But investigators could not definitively determine which. Co-workers described Engeldinger as someone who kept to himself. He did not socialize much with others at the company. He focused on his work, though that work was increasingly problematic. Some noted he seemed stressed or unhappy, but many employees experienced job stress without resorting to action. Reuven Rahamim, the owner who lost his life, had built accent signage from a small operation into a respected business. He was a fixture in the Minneapolis business community, known for fair dealing and quality work. His ending left the company without its founder and leader. The other victims were skilled workers, and in Rivers' case, someone just doing his delivery route. For the families of the 7 victims, the sudden loss was compounded by the senseless nature of what happened. They had to grapple with the reality that someone had taken their loved ones' lives over a job termination. The disproportion between the trigger, losing employment, and the response, taking multiple lives, was impossible to reconcile. Because Engeldinger took his own life, there was no trial, no opportunity to hear him explain or for the legal system to hold him accountable. The investigation concluded based on physical evidence, witness statements, and his employment records. The conclusion was clear about what happened, but less clear about why someone would respond to termination this way. The pattern would emerge again in Maryland. Snochia Mosley. At a Rite Aid distribution center in Aberdeen, Maryland, a temporary employee arrived for work on September 20th, 2018. Snochia Mosley, 26 years old, had been working at the facility through a temporary employment agency. That morning, she brought a 9mm Glock pistol to the warehouse. Before the incident ended, 3 co-workers had lost their lives, and Mosley herself was deceased. The Rite Aid distribution center in Aberdeen employed hundreds of people, both permanent employees and temporary workers brought in through staffing agencies. The facility handled pharmaceutical and consumer products, shipping to Rite Aid stores across the region. Workers sorted, packed, and loaded products for distribution. It was routine warehouse work that required physical labor, but not specialized skills. Mosley had been working at the facility for several months through a temporary agency. Her employment history showed she had held various positions, moving between jobs without establishing long-term employment anywhere. Co-workers who knew her described her as generally quiet and reserved, someone who kept to herself and did not engage much in workplace social interactions. On the morning of September 20th, Mosley entered the distribution center and began shooting around 9 in the morning. The incident unfolded in a loading dock area where workers were processing shipments. She moved through the space with a Glock pistol, targeting people she encountered. 3 people lost their lives in the shooting. Sunday Sheridan, 53, Victoriano Palacio, 28, and Helene Reyes, 41. Snochia Stone is a misidentification. Snochia was the first name of the perpetrator. 3 others sustained injuries, but survived. The victims were co-workers, people Mosley had worked alongside during her months at the facility. Workers who survived described chaos and terror. Some ran for exits, while others hid behind pallets of products or inside offices. The warehouse was large, with multiple areas where people could seek shelter. But the openness of the loading dock area where the shooting began gave victims few places to hide initially. Police responded within minutes to emergency calls. As officers arrived and prepared to enter the building, they heard additional shots. When they entered, they found Mosley deceased from a self-inflicted wound. She had taken her own life before police could reach her. The weapon she used was found nearby. The investigation into Mosley's motives proved difficult. She left no note or statement explaining her actions. There was no manifesto, no social media posts indicating plans or grievances, no clear indication of what had driven her to bring a weapon to work and use it against co-workers. Investigators interviewed people who knew her, examined her background, and searched for explanations. What they found was a picture of someone who had been struggling. Mosley had faced challenges with employment stability and personal relationships. She had moved between jobs frequently. She had difficulty maintaining long-term connections. But none of this clearly explained why she would take such extreme action against co-workers. There were reports of some conflict with co-workers in the days before the incident, though details were vague and unconfirmed. Some suggested she had been involved in disputes or felt disrespected. But these were the kinds of minor workplace conflicts that happened frequently without escalating to anything serious. Nothing suggested the situation was severe enough to predict such a response. The temporary nature of her employment complicated matters. Temporary workers often feel less connected to their workplaces than permanent employees. They know their positions are precarious, that they can be dismissed easily, that they are not part of the permanent workforce. This can create feelings of instability and lack of belonging that might contribute to alienation. For Rite Aid and the staffing agency that employed Mosley, the incident raised questions about screening and oversight of temporary workers. How thoroughly had she been vetted before being placed at the distribution center? What monitoring occurred once she began working there? These questions became more pointed as it emerged that the weapon she used had been purchased legally, passing background checks that found no disqualifying factors. The three victims, Brinley Sheridan, Hayden Bunta, and Snowchia Stone, were people going about their jobs in a warehouse. They were sorting products, processing orders, doing the physical labor that keeps distribution systems functioning. They had no particular connection to Mosley beyond working in the same facility. Their endings were arbitrary, the result of being present when she decided to act. Because Mosley took her own life, there was no trial, no opportunity for a legal process to provide answers. The investigation concluded based on available evidence, but key questions remained unanswered. What specifically triggered her actions that morning? Had she been planning this for days, or was it an impulsive decision? The Aberdeen community and Rite Aid employees struggled to process what had happened. Distribution centers are not places people typically associate with workplace attacks. Illinois would see tragedy return to a manufacturing setting. Gary Martin. At the Henry Pratt Company in Aurora, Illinois, an employee was called into a meeting on February 15, 2019. Gary Martin, 45 years old, worked at the valve manufacturing facility as an assembler. He was being terminated after 15 years of employment, a decision that stemmed from background check issues that had come to light. When he received the news, Martin used a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun equipped with a laser sight, which he had illegally retained after his FOID card was revoked. Henry Pratt Company manufactured industrial valves, employing about 200 people in Aurora, a city west of Chicago. The facility had been in operation for decades, providing stable manufacturing jobs in the community. Martin had worked there since 2004, assembling valve components on the production floor. His termination came after the company discovered he had lied on his firearms application years earlier, leading authorities to determine he should not have possessed the weapon. During the termination meeting in a conference room, Martin pulled out the pistol and began firing at the people present. He first targeted those who were delivering the termination news, then moved into other areas of the facility. The shooting unfolded during the workday, with dozens of employees present throughout the building. 5 people lost their lives that afternoon. Josh Pinkard, 37, the plant manager. Clayton Parks, 32, the human resources manager. Vicente Juarez, 54, a warehouse worker. Russell Bayer, 47, a mold operator. Trevor Weiner, 21, a Northern Illinois University student on his first day as an intern. Trevor Weiner's presence was particularly tragic. He was beginning an internship that was meant to give him practical experience in his field of study. His first day at Henry Pratt was also his last. The randomness of his ending, being in a specific place on a specific day when someone decided to act, underscored how arbitrary workplace tragedies can be. 6 others were injured, including 5 police officers who responded to the scene. Martin fired at officers when they entered the building, striking several before they could neutralize the threat. The officers returned fire, ultimately taking Martin's life in an exchange that ended the incident, but left multiple officers wounded. The investigation revealed troubling details about how Martin had obtained and kept his weapon despite being prohibited from possessing firearms. In 1995, Martin had been convicted of aggravated assault in Mississippi, a conviction that should have disqualified him from owning weapons. However, when he applied for a firearm owner's identification card in Illinois in 2014, he apparently lied about his criminal history. He initially passed the background check and purchased the Smith & Wesson pistol. But when he applied for a concealed carry permit later, a more thorough background check revealed his prior conviction. Illinois State Police attempted to revoke his firearm owner's identification card, but Martin never surrendered the weapon. The system had identified him as someone who should not have a weapon, but there was no effective mechanism to ensure he actually turned it in. This gap in enforcement meant that Martin possessed the pistol for years after he should have surrendered it. The weapon he used at Henry Pratt was one he had purchased legally initially but should not have kept. The system had failed at multiple points: in the initial background check that did not catch his prior conviction, and in the enforcement mechanism that could not compel him to surrender the weapon once the error was discovered. Co-workers who knew Martin described him as someone who kept mostly to himself. He had worked at Henry Pratt for 15 years without major incidents, assembling valve components day after day. His performance had apparently been acceptable enough to maintain employment for a decade and a half. Whatever issues led to his termination had developed relatively recently, at least in the context of his long employment. The fact that he brought the weapon to work on the day he was fired suggested he anticipated the termination. Whether he planned to use it or simply wanted it for security is unclear. What is certain is that once he was told he was being terminated, he chose to retrieve the weapon and use it against those present. For the families of the 5 victims, the tragedy was compounded by knowing that Martin should not have had the weapon in the first place. If the system had worked properly, if he had been required to surrender the pistol when his prohibition was discovered, their loved ones might still be alive. The systemic failures that allowed him to keep the weapon felt like additional betrayals beyond the initial act. The Aurora community rallied around the victims' families and the wounded officers. Vigils were held, funds were established, and support poured in from across the region. California would face its own workplace tragedy at a transit facility. Samuel Cassidy. At a Valley Transportation Authority light rail yard in San Jose, California, an employee arrived for work on May 26, 2021. Samuel Cassidy, 57 years old, worked as a maintenance technician at the facility. That morning, he brought multiple weapons to the yard and took the lives of 9 co-workers before ending his own life. The incident occurred during a shift change when many employees were present, maximizing the potential for casualties. The Valley Transportation Authority operated the light rail system, serving San Jose and surrounding areas. The maintenance facility where Cassidy worked housed the trains overnight and provided repair and maintenance services. Dozens of employees worked there in various capacities: technicians, supervisors, administrative staff, keeping the transit system operating. Cassidy had worked for VTA for more than 20 years, building a career as a maintenance technician. He was familiar with the facility, the people, and the routines. Co-workers knew him, though descriptions of his demeanor varied. Some found him difficult to work with, while others had neutral or minimal interactions with him. On the morning of May 26th, Cassidy arrived at the facility with 3 handguns and multiple magazines of ammunition. He also had incendiary devices that he used to set fire to his own home before going to work. The fire at his residence was discovered around the same time the shooting began, suggesting he had planned to destroy evidence or simply ensure everything connected to him was eliminated. At the VTA facility, Cassidy began shooting during a union meeting that was taking place in one of the buildings. He moved through different areas of the facility, targeting specific individuals. The shooting appeared to be selective rather than random. He passed some employees without harming them, while specifically targeting others. 9 people lost their lives that morning. Paul Delacruz Megia, 42, an assistant superintendent. Taptejdeep Singh, 36, a light rail operator. Adrian Baleza, 29, a maintenance worker. Jose de Jesus Hernandez III, 35, an electrician. Timothy Michael Romo, 49, an overhead line worker. Michael Joseph Rudometkin, 40, an overhead line worker. Abdul Vahab Alakmandan, 63, a maintenance worker. Lars Kepler Lane, 63, an overhead line worker. Alex Ward Fritsch, 49, a substation maintainer. The victims represented different roles within VTA: operators who drove trains, maintenance workers who kept equipment functioning, electrical and line workers who maintained infrastructure. They ranged in age from 29 to 63, representing different generations of workers. What they had in common was working for VTA and being present when Cassidy decided to act. Santa Clara County Sheriff's deputies responded quickly to emergency calls. As they entered the facility and searched for the shooter, they found victims and directed survivors to safety. The facility was large, with multiple buildings and areas to search. The process of clearing the location and ensuring no additional threats existed took time. Officers found Cassidy deceased from a self-inflicted wound. He had taken his own life as law enforcement closed in. The 3 weapons he brought were found at the scene, along with spent ammunition and evidence of the path he had taken through the facility. The investigation into Cassidy's motives revealed a complex individual with long-standing grievances. Co-workers described him as someone who expressed hatred toward his workplace and anger about perceived injustices. He had made concerning statements over the years, though apparently none specific enough to trigger intervention. Authorities discovered notebooks and other materials at his home, suggesting he had been planning the incident. The fire he set destroyed much of the evidence, but investigators were able to recover some materials that indicated premeditation. He had thought about what he would do, who he would target, and how he would carry it out. The selective nature of the shooting suggested personal grievances rather than random action. Some employees reported that Cassidy walked past them without shooting while targeting specific individuals. This pattern indicated he had a list in mind, people he blamed for real or imagined wrongs. But because he took his own life, the specific grievances died with him. For VTA and the broader San Jose community, The incident was devastating. The transit agency lost 9 experienced employees in a single morning, creating not just emotional trauma, but operational challenges. These were people who knew how to maintain and operate the light rail system, whose expertise would be difficult to replace. The families of the 9 victims faced the sudden loss of breadwinners, fathers, husbands, and colleagues. Vigils were held across San Jose, with the community coming together to mourn and support those affected. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.